Hey, welcome back, everyone. Well, some big stories for tonight. I want to go over a bit of what's happening with China right now because a lot's going on. Pretty much the Chinese Communist Party, they've assessed, they believe the United States is on its decline. They believe the United States has reached a state of chaos and they believe it's their chance to rise. And so there's some updates on this. And actually, going forward, I'm going to be having a bit more on what they're doing because as they view the United States as being in decline, they're going to become much more aggressive. They're already showing signs of it, they're already talking about it publicly. And really, this is going to hit a lot of different issues, not just with the US, but with a lot of other countries as well. Really, a lot's going to happen with China, I think, very soon. So I'll be going over a few updates on China tonight. I also want to go over this new intelligence community assessment in the United States. We've been hearing what's happening with the Biden administration targeting what they call domestic terrorists. And the definition they're going by is pretty dang broad, to the extent that it covers not just people on the conservative side, but actually a lot of people on the far left as well. Antifa, BLM, others in the language of it could be targeted. And at the same time, you have the intelligence community organizations that are not supposed to do domestic espionage, domestic spying, apparently getting involved with this. And so some big updates on that I'll be going over. I'll also be going over a few other stories, and so stick around, folks. A lot to go over tonight. And folks, it's good seeing all of you. Yeah, the world's chaotic. We don't have to be, right? Yeah, Phil Gowan, good seeing you. I said hi, Josh from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Good to see you. Thank you. Yeah, Caroline Vaughn said hello, love your show. Thank you. Thank you also. Thanks for being here. Yeah, folks, always enjoyed doing these videos, and always nice. Always nice. I feel like I'm kind of hanging out with all of you, to be honest. Yeah. All right, so let's get started on the stories. As always, folks, if you have questions, leave them in the chat, and I'll try to get to them. I'll go over a few stories first, though. Now, first off, I want to go over a few different stories with China and kind of show how these relate to each other. So let's go over a few different stories real quick, and then I'll kind of give my take on it. First off, now the Chinese Communist Party is reinforcing its different alliances. It's getting its different allies to restate their allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party, their alliances with the CCP. Now, first off, this is Bloomberg reporting. It says China may be taking rebranded Iran oil amid increased scrutiny. And it says just briefly here, China released data that showed it imported no Iranian crude for the first time in months, a sign that oil from the U.S. sanctioned nation may be masked as supplies from other countries. And it goes into some details on this. Now, it's never been a secret that the Chinese Communist Party, works with Iran, including in their nuclear weapons programs in ways they're not supposed to. In fact, one of the reasons why some of these big Chinese telecom companies are facing charges is because of allegations around this. Can't say for sure, but they have been sanctioned for it in the past and so on. And there's some pending charges on this. Now, the Iranian regime has been on the decline for a while now because they got hit so deep by Trump's sanctions. Now, the Biden administration is looking to re-sign the Iran nuclear deal and re-engage. And this is not just about nuclear weapons; it's re-engaging with Iran, opening up deals with them. They want reparations for money they lost to the U.S. sanctions, all kinds of stuff. And as they're repeatedly violating their agreements, there's even been stories of them violating similar nuclear agreements with Europe. We see now that they're also getting around U.S. sanctions with China, basically continuing doing what they've been doing for a long time, which is signing things on paper and then violating the agreements they sign. Now, that's one area of it. Next up, we have China. Russian officials meet in show of unity against EU, US. And it says here just briefly on this, the foreign ministers of China and Russia affirmed their countries' close ties at a meeting Tuesday, amid intense criticism at the new Western sanctions against them over human rights. Now, the Chinese Communist Party and the Russian government have always been kind of like frenemies, even going back to the time of the Soviet Union. Really what happened was the Soviet Union was, of course, the enemy of the free world and had the global communist revolution that was backing most communist systems in the West, including Communist Party USA. If you were a Communist Party, you had your allegiance sworn to the Soviet Union. After the Soviets collapsed, now before that, of course, they had all the conflicts with China. Amur Valley conflict over Vietnam. They had a lot of them. Um, they were still aligned with each other, but they had a lot of conflicts with each other, including shooting wars. Again, like the Amur Valley conflict. The Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Union became competitors, but they viewed the United States as the main enemy, regardless of this. Now we see after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia lost a lot of its reach into the West, into the United States, because the diaspora, right, the minute, say let's say for example, student activists or activist organizations, anti-war movements, college professors, all these groups that had sworn allegiance to the global communist revolution. That movement, as far as they were concerned, pretty much died. The Chinese Communist Party maintained those same channels, right? Subversion, through the United Front Work Department. A lot of the Russian subversion operations kind of fell apart post-Cold War. But the Russian government really maintained a lot of those networks through other forms. Russian government became, if you were a politician, you pretty much used your ill-gotten funds to buy businesses or buy land, right? And you became the oligarchy. Or you were former KGB or whatever like that, and you went into organized crime, became the Russian mafia. They still have deep penetration to other countries. Now, the Russian government, because they're hit so deeply by U.S. sanctions, pretty much alongside the Chinese Communist Party, run an alternate economy to the, say, surface U.S.-led economy. And so you do have this allegiance here taking place still. And the Russian government and the Chinese Communist Party are restating this. Now, the important thing with this is, I personally, in my assessment, I think if the U.S. tried to reach out to Russia and make allies with them, they'd probably abandon the CCP for the United States. I think Trump was hoping to do that. The whole U.S.-Russia, scandal, fake news thing that the mainstream media spread, I should say, really threw a wrench in the possibilities of doing that. And so that did push Russia back to align itself with China. You do see this now. Now, there's also some new updates with China and North Korea. But first, I'm going to go over real quick our sponsor for the night. Now, folks, I've mentioned before that Crossroads is totally demonetized. It's alongside about 7 other channels of Epoch Times and our sister media, NTD. YouTube has totally demonetized us. That's why we don't have Super Chat, for example. But we do have sponsors, and really they've helped us quite a bit. Tonight's sponsor is American Hartford Gold. And with all the turbulence of the economy, the stock market, and with the risks of inflation, you can consider investing in an asset that's often stable and that has been on the incline. That is gold and silver. Now, American Hartford Gold is one of the highest rated firms in the country with an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. They can have your gold and silver delivered right to your doorstep or into your IRA. To learn more, please check out the link we have in the comments below, where American Hartford Gold is providing a free 25-page information guide. Even if you're not looking to buy gold or silver, you just want to learn about how to do it or the benefits of it, check out that information guide. I think you'll find it useful. Now, if you call them now, you can get up to $1,500 of free silver on all qualifying first orders. The phone number is 877-260-2764. Or you can text Joshua to 65532. Now, that said, folks, let's go into one last part of this new China alliance forming against the free world we have right now. The last of these is actually an interesting one because it's something that I thought was going away for a while. But here we are again. It says here, this is Epoch Times reporting, China, North Korea reaffirm alliance against hostile forces as North Korea fires missiles. It says, just briefly, the communist leaders of China and North Korea recently exchanged messages to reaffirm their historical alliance in fighting against, quote, hostile forces, a key word here for the United States. According to Chinese and North Korean media, North Korea also fired missiles for a second time since President Joe Biden took office. Now, how many of you remember when Trump first took office and before, how often North Korea was threatening, global nuclear holocaust, as they were calling it? How many of you remembered how often it was that North Korea was threatening nuclear war on the West? Yes, they launched, missile tests and so on. They did a few of those under Trump. They're doing those again right now. Typically, the way this worked in the past was that North Korea would threaten nuclear war against the West. They threatened to attack Guam. They'd even threaten the U.S. mainland. They claimed they could do it, right? The Chinese Communist Party would back their different programs. The Chinese Communist Party would supply them with materials to make their nuclear weapons. And what happened was is the Chinese Communist Party was trying to coerce the United States to approach it as the go-between with North Korea. Because in order to engage with North Korea diplomatically, you have to go through China normally. Now, Trump threw a wrench into that whole system. Remember when Trump went to the North Korean DMZ, right, the demilitarized zone, and he met with Kim Jong Un, and he actually crossed over to the North Korean side of the border, and they like walked together. It was surprising, actually. I never thought I'd see anything like it personally. Of course, North Korea started moving away from Trump afterwards. I think Trump didn't stay engaged with them as much as he could have. One of the big questions would be, what could he do to change their regime, this communist system? Now we're seeing, though, that basically that alliance that North Korea had with the Chinese Communist Party is being reestablished. If you want to get into the deeper elements of what's happening with China and North Korea, it's this. North Korea, the North Korean regime, was more closely aligned with the Jiang faction. There's two main political systems in China. I wouldn't call them parties, but factions. The two main factions are the Jiang faction and the Xi faction. Xi Jinping, current head of the Chinese Communist Party, Jiang Zemin, 2 leaders ago. There was Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping. Jiang Zemin, even though he's very old and not doing so hot, actually controls a large part of the Chinese Communist Party still. And the Jiang faction and the Xi faction are kind of at each other's throats. They've been at each other's throats for a long time. The North Korean regime was more favorable towards Xi for a long time. And it seems to be the case now that Xi has bridged that gap with North Korea. And it seems to be the case, as we're seeing with these new updates, that Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un are more closely aligned. Now, for the United States, this means a few things. It means that China is very likely going to, well, it means a couple things. First, North Korea is probably going to start threatening nuclear war again, first off. We can expect to see this. We can also expect to see all the media pumping it up, right? It's the noise they make. Then we're going to see China offering itself as the go-between, the diplomatic go-between. The U.S. will start very likely giving packages, financial packages to North Korea to calm them down. And China will look like the global peacemaker and for negotiating these deals. This is typically how it worked, and it seems this whole thing is starting up again. The other possibility with this, though, which we've been seeing a bit of, is that the Chinese Communist Party, now this is the whole picture of what we're seeing with Iran, China, Russia, North Korea. Basically, as I mentioned briefly before, the Chinese Communist Party, in its assessment, and you can watch in the last episode I did, the last Q&A we did on Tuesday, I mentioned, I think, the last story we covered, the Chinese Communist Party, in its own assessment, in its own words, in fact, Xi Jinping's own words, they believe the United States is on the decline. They believe that it is now the Chinese Communist Party's time to rise to be the leader of the world community, the leader on the world stage. They believe the U.S. has fallen into chaos. They don't believe it's capable of ruling anymore. They don't believe it's capable of basically being the system that determines the governmental structure for the whole world, essentially, which under the Pax Americana, peace under America, that has been the case since the end of World War II. The Chinese Communist Party believes now that the Pax Sinica is the world model, and they're going to be promoting the China model. And as part of this system, they're creating their new digital currency. They're reestablishing their alliances with allies, and they're going to use these alliances to strong arm and go by hook or by crook to undermine different countries, bribe them, make alliances, and push out U.S. power all around the world. One of the main ways they're going to be doing this, in fact, I think Epoch Times had a few stories in the works on this. One of the main ways they're going to be doing this is through what they call the string of pearls, something we've been seeing in development for a long time, which is the Chinese Communist Party's control of different trade choke points. Now, if they can control the trade choke points like at Djibouti, like the Panama Canal, like the South China Sea, for example, they can start denying access to other seafaring nations, including to the U.S. Navy, unless we want to wage war on them, which we probably don't want to do, because all the military assessments show the U.S. losing in near China battles currently. And so what's going to happen The Chinese Communist Party is able to control the, say, peace by sea, right? Something that goes back to the old days of colonialism and so on, right? Whoever controls the trade choke points controls global trade, controls essentially world economy, controls the systems of power. And through this, the Chinese Communist Party can begin asserting itself on the global stage, including projecting power and including denying U.S. ability to project power. For example, denying access to U.S. aircraft carriers to key regions, which means the U.S., unless it can build physical bases, will not be able to project air power or sea power. The main strength of the U.S. military, right? If you were to ask like NATO guys or something, they typically say it's air support and really the intelligence systems. Without having air support, without having nearby aircraft carriers that can work as staging bases for this kind of air support and surveillance technologies, the U.S. is set back pretty far. And so the CCP is looking to do this. This is what they're working on currently. And it's going to be a pretty big battle internationally as this happens. Now, there's a few updates on this because we see different alliances forming. The European Union, the United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, India, they're all positioning themselves differently. Now, I want to get a bit into what's happening with that and also a bit into what's happening with the US right now because there's some pretty concerning developments here too. But first, let's go over a few questions. So, folks, again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. All right, let's see here. Is from George on Patreon. And that note, folks, again, if you do want to support us, we do have Patreon and we do have Donor Box. And so if you want to support Crossroads, please do consider donating to us on Patreon or Donor Box. You can find the links in the description below. This is from George on Patreon, though. He says, with China's draconian lockdowns in their cities, how come we don't hear about how their economy is doing in these lockdowns? Job losses, businesses closing. The U.S. has less harsher lockdowns, and it's destroyed some sectors of the economy. So shouldn't we hear the same thing from China? If there is information about how China's economy is doing in their lockdowns, what is it? So there's two things the CCP is doing. One, the Chinese Communist Party destroyed China's economy, demolished it. The thing is, though, the CCP knows it can print money and then lie to the world about the value of their economy. They can show, 3.5%, economic growth every year. And, the rest of the world just kind of goes up and eats out of their hand and says, yes, of course, Master Xi Jinping, right? They can claim their money is worth whatever they want to claim. They can claim that their companies are doing as well as they want, which is why Chinese companies cannot be audited on the U.S. stock market. The CCP blocks that from happening. Now, currently, the SEC is trying to overturn that. In fact, there are some updates on that today that maybe I'll go over that in a future episode. But the Trump administration is trying to push this. The Chinese Communist Party can claim its economy is worth whatever they want. They can claim that its companies are doing as well or poorly as they please. And because of this, Western investors pour money into the CCP and they get money off it because of the way the global financial system works. They play the system. Now, China at the same time has what they call zombie factories that keep the lights on but don't produce anything. And they also have different ways of inflating their economy, building ghost cities, keeping people working, keeping money flowing internally in China. The way you keep an economy going, right, you need to have internal inflow of money. You need money to circulate internally within the country. You need people to buy things. This is the way that the modern financial system works, so on, which is why, again, illegal immigration is so detrimental to the U.S. because people tend to send the money out of the country. But China wants money to circulate internally within their own economy. Now, as this is all happening, right, the CCP, again, locked down much harsher than probably any other country in the world. They destroyed their economy. But while they're doing this, while they destroyed their economy, they've lied to the world about the value of their economy, which means they can still trade, by mitigating the way inflation works, by controlling the way inflation works, which means that the CCP officials weren't really affected by it as much. And at the same time as doing this, the CCP can manufacture a bounce back by just writing in the books whatever they want in terms of value. Now, that may get overturned to an extent if their companies get audited, and there is a push now to get their companies audited on the stock exchange. But at the same time they're doing this, the Chinese Communist Party is pushing two different narratives. The first narrative they're pushing is they're claiming that China uplifted the Chinese people out of poverty. They had this new war on poverty in China. And by doing this, they basically changed the criteria of measuring poverty. I think it's like $3.50 a day or something ridiculous like that. By manipulating the numbers on this, they've convinced Western media that China uplifted the Chinese people out of poverty. And you have many clowns in the media, in government, and international institutions playing up this note. Look at how China bounced back from poverty. Look at how the Chinese Communist Party uplifted the Chinese people from poverty. It's a nonsense narrative, totally nonsense. They changed the numbers on what constitutes poverty and then claim they did it. And at the same time, they control, again, the numbers coming out of China. The thing they're doing with this is they're promoting the China model globally through that narrative. They're saying that China has a working model for countries to bounce back, to build back better from the virus. This is the narrative they're using. In other words, they had catalyst, virus, destruction of their economy. They have the solution to it, right? The negation, right? The building back of their system, and they have the final outcome, the final synthesis, which is the Chinese Communist Party right now is promoting what they call a mixed model economy, where through building back better, right, quote unquote, the Chinese Communist Party is basically establishing a mixed model economy, mixed ownership, meaning the government partially owns every business. This is the model the CCP is going to be promoting. This is the model the CCP is using internally in China to build back from the virus. This is the model they're telling the whole world right now works, right? They're telling the whole world that this model works. This is the model that different government officials or different media organizations or different think tanks and academics who are eating out of the CCP's hand are going to start telling the whole world works. They're going to tell the whole world this works. And this is the model the CCP and all of its clown, hand puppets around the world are going to be, flapping their heads about trying to promote. This is the future of the world if the CCP is able to win on this. This is the model they're promoting. And so that's the state of the Chinese economy currently, essentially, right? Next here we have Zoe S. You said, I haven't kept up with the Suez Canal issue. What's going on there? I'm not sure the latest update. The Chinese Communist Party has what it calls a string of pearls. And so the Chinese Communist Party essentially at every major trade choke point in the world, whether it's Djibouti, whether it's, again, South China Sea, a lot of oil shipments go through. They're a huge portion of the world's oil shipments, whether it's the Nicaragua Canal they're doing, whether it's the Panama Canal, whether it's, Suez Canal, you name it. The Chinese Communist Party has been making deals with the countries at the trade choke points. They've been able to build military bases at some of them. They've been able to do port projects with some of them where the CCP builds the port. And then by the country defaulting on debt through, again, debt traps, the CCP is able to gain ownership over it. Through this method, the CCP has gained control at every major trade choke point in the world. I've been writing about this going back to 2005. And through that, they're able to, one, project power, naval power, and two, they're able to control global shipping, global economy. And so using these two methods, this is what the CCP is doing with what they call the string of pearls. This goes back, if you get into like naval history stuff, if you were to hang out with U.S. naval officers, you would hear them talk about, history of the Peloponnesian War and great power competition. You'd hear it so much, you'd get sick. You'd want to just stop listening to it. They say it so much. But when they're talking about it, they're talking about this, history of naval power and what it means when countries begin controlling trade choke points and so on. They get into this whole argument. And essentially, it's what the CCP is doing right now. The Chinese Communist Party is using this historical method of basically world dominance through the control of trade choke points and military strength choke points when it comes to control of the seas. CCP is doing it. They've been doing it for a long time. And to the point right now where we're at, it has already come to fruition. They currently have it. Let's see. It's from Brian Kruin. He said, hey, Josh, can you give an update on the communism documentary? Yeah, I know we've been talking about this for a long time now. Yes, we are currently in the process of filming. In fact, I spent most of my day today filming for for that documentary. What we're planning on is a 7-part special feature series on the history of communism. I think you'll find it very interesting. I go back to the French Revolution, including some of the ideologies at the time, including some really freaky stuff not a lot of people talk about, like the cult of reason, the Illuminati of Bavaria under Adam Weishaupt, the Babeuf conspiracy. Um, get into all of it, really. A lot of parts of the history of communism that very few people talk about, including its roots in naturism, other weird ideologies, Hegelianism, and so on, and what that meant at the time of Marx, how it was used, how it transformed, and how it became what we're currently dealing with. I think you'll all find it very interesting. Yeah, Peter Rossi, you mentioned Rousseau. Yeah, I get into Rousseau as well. 7-part series on that coming out. We're in the process of filming right now, and so I think you'll all like it quite a bit. A few of you asked as well what happened to my books. I'm in the process of moving, and if all goes according to plan, which I hope it does, by this coming Sunday when I do my next live Q&A, everything should be back into place. I should be moved into my new place, and everything will be back to normal. It'll be wonderful. I can't wait personally. It'll be wonderful. Now, let's see here. I'll do one more question, then we'll go into a few other stories. This is from Cade Hit. You said, do you have any updates on Myanmar or Burma? Yes. So basically, it seems to be the case that the Chinese Communist Party has played a hand in the military coup that took place in Burma, Myanmar. It does seem to be the case that this happened. Right now, they're cracking down on dissidents, poets, shooting people in the streets. The government there, the military, the people who succeeded at the coup, right? There you have mass protests on the streets. You have them killing dissidents. The Chinese Communist Party does appear to be engaged in it to an extent. The Biden administration is talking about placing sanctions on the Myanmar government. I'll have to see what that works. One problem you have is that if they don't target the CC, this is the reality of U.S. sanctions. If you don't deal with the China issue, U.S. sanctions do nothing. U.S. sanctions push countries to join the alternate economy, the China-led economy. And the CCP, as we speak, is pushing out this new digital currency that bypasses the entire U.S.-led financial institution. Without the US dollar being the basis of purchases internationally, guess who controls it? China. And the CCP is promoting its new digital currency run through its state. It's a central bank, China State Bank, using that to basically bypass US sanctions, which means that if the US sanctions countries and doesn't solve the China issue, all it does is pushes those countries to affiliate themselves to align with China. In fact, I could tell you a lot of stories of different folks around the world who governments, for example, are dealing with, let's say, far left organizations that are subverting the countries and could take pretty extreme measures to deal with it. Is happening. Brazil, for example. But were they to deal with it and, for example, kick out these people, throw them in prison or whatever, they'd face sanctions by the United States. And if they face sanctions by the United States, they'll have no other choice but to align with the Chinese Communist Party, which for them is worse than letting these far left groups essentially take over their countries through subversion. And so this is the unfortunate reality of U.S. sanctions and the effect they have when nothing is done against the Chinese Communist Party. And so it does seem to be the case that Burma is in a funky state right now. It does seem to be the case again that the government there, that the military there did have some, say, Chinese Communist Party did have some role to play in what happened there. And if the CCP is able to maintain that control, maintain that influence, and the Biden administration is now putting sanctions on the Myanmar coup, I don't even call it a government, military junta, it's going to push that. It's going to push them to align with the CCP, and so the CCP can use this to gain a new ally within its new alliance. Essentially, this is what's happening. Yeah, the unfortunate reality of what is happening right now in China, its alliances, and how chaos is used to establish new order through these institutions. This is the unfortunate reality taking place in Burma right now. All right, folks, let's go over a few more stories. That said, now I want to talk a little bit more about China. Then I want to get into what's happening in the U.S. when it comes to the domestic terrorism argument, because there's actually some pretty concerning things going on with this. Concerningly broad definitions of what constitutes domestic terrorism and concerning developments in the way this information is being collected. Because it seems that the intelligence community now is focusing internally in the United States, which they're not supposed to do. Domestic spying is supposed to be beyond what they're able to do. But I'll be getting into that in just a minute. First, let's go over a few updates with US and China and the EU and India and the pushback against the new order the CCP is trying to establish. Let's go over this. Now, first off, this is from The Hill. It says why the US should care about the China-India blackout war. And it says here, China apparently blacked out Mumbai, India recently by cyber attack. This is serious. Hear me out. Credibly threatening that Beijing could plunge all of India into darkness through cyber warfare. Experts warned that national electric grids are a technological Achilles heel. India officials are understandably alarmed and now regretting that their national electric power grid and other critical infrastructures depend so much upon equipment imported from China that likely increases their vulnerability. Now, first off on this, what are we seeing here? You're seeing what happens when the Chinese Communist Party is able to gain control over a country's electric grid. Conveniently, remember the Biden administration removed different protections that protected the US from having China take over the electric grid. Remember those stories? Now we see the results of that in another country. In India, the CCP allegedly, according to the concerns there, was able to use the assets it put into place within the Indian electric grid to shut down their electric grid. This is a form of warfare. The Chinese Communist Party even writes this in its military doctrine. When they talk about the Assassin's Mace program, specifically on using technologies like this, right? EMP attacks, shutting down the systems that enable a country to function, high Earth orbit nuclear detonation, hemp attacks, they call them, you name it, microwave weapons, they name all these things. This is an example of the CCP using unconventional warfare to basically, it seems to be the case, shut down the Indian electric grid through cyber attack. Now, this is concerning on the part that, one, it's happened in India, concerning, two, that the US is letting the same types of programs start to take root here because they removed the protections that would prevent the CCP from controlling the US electric grid. And three, this is also very concerning because the US is involved in this Quad alliance, this alliance with India, Japan, and Australia against the CCP mainly. And what does that mean? Now, I think it's good that the US teams up with India, and I think it's good that we stay close to them, but India right now is in a very deep conflict with the Chinese Communist Party. And I've actually talked to some folks about this recently, in fact, who military advisor type folks who say that India, the possibility of them getting involved in a actual war with China is becoming something of deep concern. If that happens, this could turn into a new world war, very much like the way that World War I started, right? Alliances formed, which is happening right now. One country within that alliance, or two countries in that alliance, have a conflict. Everyone gets pulled into it. To see what happens. India right now hit by a massive cyber attack, apparently by China, shutting down their electric grid in Mumbai. And they're blaming the Chinese Communist Party. It does seem to be the case that there's evidence of that. And tensions are getting tough. Tensions are getting high. And alliances are forming. Now, as this happens, the European Union and China are entering their own war of words and tit-for-tat sanctions. Some updates on this. Now, it's according to Asia Nikkei. It says tensions between the European Union and China rose sharply this week over the imposition of tit-for-tat sanctions and the opening round of a potential war of words. The French Foreign Ministry summoned Chinese Ambassador Liu Sheyi, and Beijing's embassy in Paris insulted scholars and demanded a member of parliament to cancel a trip to Taiwan. Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian accused Liu of insults, incentives, and threats towards scholars and members of parliament, with the ministry adding that, quote, these methods of intimidation are unacceptable and exceed all commonly accepted boundaries for an embassy, according to Agency France Presse. Chinese embassies have stepped up their aggression against Western countries in recent months. You notably have similar conflicts across pretty much the entire European Union right now with China. These tensions are increasing. Same thing with Australia right now. Same thing with the US and even Canada to some extent. Now, at the same time as this is happening, this is Politico reporting. And it says here, China throws EU trade deal to the wolf warriors. And it says China's double-barreled sanctions attack on the EU on Monday means the landmark Beijing-Brussels trade deal is now in life support. Furious at being targeted by Chinese sanctions on a day of high diplomatic drama, prominent European parliamentarians are threatening not to ratify the EU-China Investment Pact sealed in December. And at the same time this is happening, another story here, one from the UK. Let's get into it. It says here, the UK's decision yesterday to impose Magnitsky sanctions against 4 Chinese government officials is extremely welcome, but long overdue, and not enough. It's a good start, but we must hope it signals the intention of further action and not just a fig leaf to critics of the government's China policy. Made in concert with the European Union, Canada, and the United States, this action contains the seed of a much-needed coordinated approach from the free world to China. Now, a few interesting points on this. What you're seeing right now is the trajectory that began during the Trump administration. I wouldn't credit Trump entirely with this. Remember what happened, right? The Trump administration was taking a hard line on China. Prior to Trump, you had Obama, Clinton, Bush, going back all the way to Richard Nixon, and is basically making a deal with the Chinese Communist Party, bringing them into the capitalist system, quote unquote. Even though it still wasn't quite real capitalism, it's state capitalism, aka socialism. Brought them into the world system. The CCP began taking control of international systems through that. Basically, the position from the U.S. and U.S. leaders going back to Nixon, arguably even before that to, even World War II era politics. Basically, the United States has had a pretty bad deal in terms of how to deal with China. Trump changed that. Trump had a hardline approach, economic warfare approach, countering them on every front and taking some very strong measures to deal with them. Things that me covering China since 2008, I never thought a world leader would do. Like sanctioning CCP officials for human rights abuses directly. Like, for example, canceling trade deals. Like, for example, labeling or designating Chinese state media as foreign missions of the CCP. So they function basically as branches of the CCP. He did a lot of very strong things against China. And then also going after the networks here, academics, journalists, and so on who've taken money or made deals with the CCP, including many politicians as well. Now, that was the U.S. approach to China. And I would argue that a lot of people in Europe, they kind of still didn't really get behind the U.S. That changed, not because I think of the U.S., maybe to an extent. That changed mainly because of the virus outbreak. When the Chinese Communist Party, again, the virus started in Wuhan, spread out from Wuhan, and the CCP became very hostile to other countries. It tried doing mask diplomacy and launched this new form of what they call wolf warrior diplomacy, which is a very tough, hardline, aggressive diplomatic approach where they regard kind of everybody as enemies, essentially. It backfired. Many European countries, Australia, many countries, Japan, India, it had an opposite effect on them. And they began pushing back very strongly against the CCP. And because the U.S. trajectory was on that path as well, the U.S. was able to form the Quad Alliance along with India, Japan, and Australia. And you also had pushback from other countries getting into the momentum of this. You're now seeing that momentum continuing, regardless of the fact that the Biden administration is rolling back some of these policies. Which means that regardless of how the U.S. positions itself, you're likely going to see India, Japan, Australia, Europe, and other countries continue on that trajectory with or without the U.S. The U.S. is showing signs that it's going to continue on this to an extent. The problem you have, however, is that while there's this diplomatic, political, and even somewhat military hardening of stances with China, Wall Street and the banking industry are maintaining all their ties to the CCP. And they're able to pour money into the CCP, basically playing both sides of this conflict as this plays out. Unless that is dealt with, you're going to have the same thing that happened going back to like the Napoleonic Wars, where the financial institutions in the world basically play both sides of conflicts and are able to almost determine who wins or loses based on the loan systems. The corrupt financial industry, right? Playing this behind the scenes role with global conflict. Same thing as always. Now, as this happens again, the CCP views the US in decline, but at the same time, the global community alongside the United States, even independent of the United States, is pushing back against them. Now, let's go into one other. Actually, let me go over a couple questions, and I want to go over what's happening with this domestic terrorism issue in the US, because some pretty concerning issues with this, folks. I'll just do a couple questions and we'll jump into that. It's from Marie Miller. You said, do we really owe China lots of money? Yes, the United States, China owns a lot of US debt, actually not much more than some countries. Like I think Japan might even own more US debt than China does. I did a lot of episodes on this in the past, especially during the early days of the virus outbreak, talking about the real story of US-China debt and so on. China buying, US securities and so on. It's not as controlling as people like to make it sound. And at the same time, the US actually owns a lot of China debt, more than the CCP owns of US debt. If the US were to actually call it in and the CCP has not paid a dime on it, unlike the United States, not only could we basically eliminate all of our debt with China, we would actually have money left over. And so, yeah, it just needs a politician strong enough to actually do it, and nobody's done it yet. Even Trump didn't act on it. Let's see here. This is from Laura Petchel. You said, what is the CCP digital currency name? They call it the digital yuan. The digital yuan. This is from Daryl Thomas. He said, can the boundary states take the responsibility of finishing the wall? You're referring to the United States. I understand that the wall is already funded. And so the United States was already pushing forward with building this wall along the US-Mexico border. It's actually costing the Biden administration money to keep things on hold, because you have all the assets there, including construction equipment, basically just sitting there, and the US still has to pay for it. The wall was very close to being finished. The Biden administration stopped the building of it. Now you have a huge border crisis. Now, as we speak right now, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, is launching an independent investigation into Biden's shutdown of the building of the wall. And it's possible that they may find some issues with the way the Biden administration handled this. In other words, yes, building the wall would be easy to do. All Biden would have to do is just say, keep building it. We're still paying for it, regardless of whether it's built or not. He just has to say, do it. Don't just sit there and do nothing, which is what they're being told to do right now, while we have a U.S. border crisis, a serious border crisis. Yeah, he's just preventing it from happening at this point. All right, let's jump into the next story, because a few things related to this. Now, let me go over just a couple quick updates. Actually, let me go first into this domestic terrorism issue, because I think this is really one of the biggest concerns I have right now for this country. And it's something that's affecting U.S. military readiness, because they're using race politics and identity politics to alter the way our military functions. The race narrative is becoming the backbone of even the green narrative. It's becoming the backbone of all the reform of the schools. It's becoming the backbone of the way that government institutions are basically running things now. This is the new order, the new way of doing things. And it's interesting here, actually, Glenn Greenwald, who I believe is either a socialist or an actual communist in terms of political leanings, wrote this very strong criticism of what's happening right now. It's actually interesting to see him on it. Again, not a conservative by any means whatsoever, right? Glenn Greenwald. And he wrote this. He said, the U.S. intelligence community flouting laws is increasingly involving itself in domestic politics. And listen to this. Now, Glenn Greenwald reports, he says, A report declassified last Wednesday by the Department of Homeland Security is raising serious concerns about the possibly illegal involvement by the intelligence community in U.S. domestic political affairs. Entitled, Domestic Violent Extremism Poses Heightened Threat in 2021, the March 1st report from the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, states that it was prepared in, quote, consultation with the Attorney General and Secretary of Homeland Security and was drafted by the National Counterterrorism Center, Federal Bureau of Investigation, the CIA, and Department of Homeland Security, DHS, with contributions from the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA. Its primary point is this, quote, the IC, or the intelligence community, assesses that domestic violent extremists, or DVEs as they call them, who are motivated by a range of ideologies and galvanized by recent political and societal events in the United States, pose an elevated threat to the homeland in 2021. And they say this, quote, while asserting that the most lethal of these threats is posed by, quote, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, RMVEs, racially motivated violent extremists, and militia violent extremists, they call MVEs. They're making acronyms for Americans here. They're designated as terrorists. It makes animal rights and environmental activists, pro-choice extremists, and anarchists. Quote, those who oppose capitalism and all forms of globalization. So if you're on the left and you oppose capitalism, you could now be designated as a violent extremist. Not only if you plan to engage in violence, but if you plan to engage in coercion to achieve those goals. If you oppose globalization, right? If you oppose capitalism, you fall under this. If you oppose globalization, you can fall under this. And it continues to the right, right? That's to the left. To the right, sovereign citizen movements, anti-abortion activists, and those deemed motivated by racial or ethnic hatreds. Now it says the U.S. security state apparatus regards the agenda of domestic violent extremists as derived from, quote, anti-government or anti-authority sentiment. So if you folks are demonstrating anti-government or, quote, anti-authority sentiment, which includes, quote, opposition to perceived economic, racial, or social hierarchies. So if you oppose some kind of perceived economic hierarchy, a racial hierarchy, or a social hierarchy, you may be an extremist under this designation. Is anyone who opposes the current prevailing ruling class, this is Greenwald saying this. Greenwald is saying this, right? He says, in sum, to the Department of Homeland Security, an extremist is anyone who opposes the current prevailing ruling class and system for distributing power. Anyone they believe is prepared to use violence, intimidation, or coercion in pursuit of these causes then becomes a domestic violent extremist, subject to a vast array of surveillance, monitoring, and other forms of legal restrictions. So get that, folks. If you oppose their systems, you are considered an extremist. If you prepare to use violence, intimidation, or coercion, you are considered a violent domestic extremist. And that is when you can be targeted by these systems. Now, of course, I think, say, going after people who plan to use violence, fine. But if you're talking about people who just, believe in, say, opposing social hierarchies or so on, it's concerning. Now, the thing is, they're painting a very broad brush with this, which is interesting to hear. I'm going to talk about that a bit more in just a bit, but I want to go over actually one of these slides with you first. This is an actual slide from this report. Let me show you this. Have a look at this. This is an actual slide from this government report. Now, note here, this includes racially. These are the categories: racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, animal rights / environmental violent extremists, right? Far left, abortion related violent extremists. They're including both anti and pro, anti-government / anti-authority violent extremists. If you oppose the government or if you're considered anti-authority. And they even have a category for all other violent extremists. Very, very broad brush. Let me explain some of this. Now, get this. This is an actual quote from it. That one of these includes ideological agendas derived from this is the anti-government, ideological agendas derived from anti-government or anti-authority sentiment. So if you have an anti-government or anti-authority sentiment, you could be called an extremist, including, quote, perceived government overreach, negligence, or illegitimacy. If you believe there's overreach of the federal government, you could be called an extremist. If you believe that the government is negligent of something, you can be called an extremist. And if you believe that the government is illegitimate, you could be called an extremist. Now, the irony of all this is that technically, under their own designations, most of the, ironically, political establishment, media establishment, and even some of the internal, deep state establishment in the government would have been guilty of this under Trump. How many of them had, hashtag not my president? Wouldn't that be challenging the legitimacy of the government? Wouldn't that be claiming the government is illegitimate? Why is it now that saying the government you don't regard it as legitimate would make you an extremist? If you perceive that there's government overreach to this extent, again, you can be designated under this. Now, you won't be targeted, we believe, we hope, based on the wording of this, you won't be targeted under this unless you plan to use violence, coercion, or intimidation to achieve those goals. But let's go into this a bit further, because this, in addition to these categories, there's also the broad brush one. This is all the other ones. It says DVEs, in other words, these domestic violent extremists, right? This is how it defines all the other ones. DVEs with ideological agendas that are not otherwise defined under one of the other domestic terrorism threat categories. In other words, anything, right? Domestic violent extremists with ideological agendas that are not otherwise defined under one of the other domestic terrorism threat categories. In other words, they're leaving the slate almost totally open. And it says this including a combination of personal grievances and belief with potential bias related to religion, gender, or sexual orientation. So if you have personal grievances or biases related to any religion, gender, or sexual orientation, you are an extremist. Congratulations. This is the broad brush they're painting here, left and right. If you don't believe government policy, if you don't believe government agenda, if you don't support government overreach, if you believe these issues even exist, congratulations, you are an extremist. Now, the irony with all this, now keep in mind, designation of having extreme beliefs by this definition is one thing. Being designated a DVE, domestic violent extremist, would mean the plan to use violence, coercion, or intimidation. And presumably, most people who hold any of these beliefs, most people would not want to use violence, coercion, or intimidation to achieve them, meaning they would not be designated under this. But this does play to the element of narrative. Now, how do these systems typically work? Typically, this is what under communist systems you would call power words, right? You have a word or a phrase that you imbue with, revolutionary potential. It becomes a power word, a keyword, a propaganda slogan, domestic violent extremist. It sounds intimidating, right? If you were to hear people 5 years ago talk about domestic violent extremists, what would you think of? I would think like actual terrorist organizations. I'd think, groups planning to do terrible things. And I'm like, good, hopefully the government goes after them, because who doesn't oppose domestic violent extremists? But what they've done is altered the content of the language. They've altered the content of the language. Domestic extremist, by this definition, would be anybody who opposes almost any part of the government, anybody who opposes any government policy, and anybody who opposes just about any kind of social justice narrative they're promoting. Now, the irony of this is the extent to which they'll actually enforce this. Now, I would argue that isn't it, for example, if they're going after evangelical Christians, in which in their military trainings they're even designating as this, wouldn't that include, for example, potential bias related to religion? Does not seem to be the case, right? Does not seem to be the case that they're including that. And so they're using this as they see fit. They're using this as they see fit to create a very scary sounding word, the implications of which does not actually mean what it appears to mean on the surface. They're painting a very broad brush to basically target domestically Americans. Now, Greenwald says something interesting, which I want to go over, then I'm going to explain just a bit more on this. Greenwald states this, quote, "In particular, the report's acknowledgement that it was compiled by institutions, including the Department of Homeland Security, with contributions from the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency, has alarmed numerous members of the House Intelligence Committee. On Thursday, all 10 minority members of that committee wrote a previously unreported letter to the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, quote, to raise serious concerns about the production of this document by the intelligence community and to seek clarification of the facts related to its production." In other words, even the government right now is very concerned about this. Even the House is very concerned about this. He continues, "But the more substantive danger is the role played by the CIA and other intelligence agencies in the domestic politics of the US, all in the name of fighting, quote, domestic terrorism. Similar dangers were previously created by the Bush and Obama administration in the name of fighting international terrorism. The Intelligence Committee members, citing the fact that the intelligence community is subject to long-standing prohibitions against domestic activities, so on, so on." They're using the Patriot Act, they're using the doors that were opened for things like this to happen to broaden the brush of what the definition of terrorism means in this case, to broaden the brush of what extremist means in this case, to engage in things that would normally be illegal, the surveillance and monitoring of American citizens domestically. Bush opened the door with the Patriot Act, right? You now have this targeting a huge portion of the United States, potentially. Now, presumably, most people who hold the views that go against anything that we've mentioned here, which is if you oppose capitalism, if you're a socialist, you'd be designated under this. If you oppose globalism, even Bernie Sanders opposed some of this stuff, right? He was opposed to open borders. You could be considered an extremist. If you are a pro-abortion, anti-abortion, I assume almost everybody falls in one of those two categories. You could be deemed as having some type of extremist view. If you oppose any religion, presumably even Christianity, but who knows if they'll include that, you could be called an extremist. If you oppose any of the gender narratives, you could be called an extremist. Now, that does not mean you're a DVE, domestic violent extremist, but because to fall under that, you'd have to have not only these views, which they paint just about everything, but you would also have to, again, want to engage in violence, coercion, or intimidation, which hopefully narrows it quite a bit. But the concerning thing is how this narrative is going to be used, how these keywords are going to be used, right? Domestic violent extremists, because it sounds very intimidating. Now, the government can go and talk about the threat of domestic violent extremism, and they can make it sound very scary, and they can start purging government departments. They can start purging the military. They can start purging the police departments. They're already doing this. And by using this as the motivating narrative to do race trainings or ideology trainings, or to root out extremism from their ranks, quote unquote, right? I'm sure you've heard that. It means that they're doing this, that they're targeting anybody who disagrees with anything essentially the government is doing right now. Anybody who questions the legitimacy of any of their actions, anybody who questions the legitimacy of any of their narratives. Now, the irony of all this, as I've mentioned before, and I'll say it again, right? The irony of this, I've mentioned the groups that oftentimes engage in the overthrow, the destabilization, and the overthrow of an existing system. The elements of chaos, in this case in the United States, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, organizations like this, they will be targeted under this. In fact, Antifa is already listed as one of these. Antifa is already being called out as a DVE, domestic violent extremist organization. This is why Lenin called them useful idiots, groups like this. This is why, again, Che Guevara was killed by Fidel Castro, because he did not need, once he took power, an element of chaos. You no longer need destabilization and demoralization once the system you're trying to create has taken power. Elements that previously agitated the system in order to destabilize it to enable for takeover like this are usually the first ones to be destroyed because they are the first ones to become disenfranchised by what they've created. Because it doesn't represent, once they see it in practice, the socialist dream, the carrot on the stick being hung in front of them that they imagined it would be. They find that they've created a totalitarian system, one that represents every practice they thought they were overthrowing. And so typically, they're the first ones to become disenfranchised. Already we see Antifa, for example, turning against the Biden administration. Ironically, the system they helped create. And so you are seeing this move forward. This is currently happening in the United States. And so that said, folks, I'll be keeping you all updated on this as we go forward. Concerning developments, it does seem to be the case there's a lot of pushback against this within the U.S. government. And again, the way the U.S. is set up, important to note, we have 50 different states, each of which has its own separate government. And the ability of the federal government to push against state law, is limited to an extent. And also we'll have to see whether Democrats start pushing back against this. Presumably, if socialists are labeled as DVEs at this point or called extremists at this point, and they paint with a broad enough brush to designate them under such narratives, maybe some of them will start turning against it as well. Maybe it means that the supermajority they have will take a hit. And we'll have to see how this unfolds. Very likely the way this is going to develop, they're probably going to target Antifa, I would imagine, Proud Boys, and probably Oath Keepers, militias first. It does seem to be the case that's happening as we speak, in fact. And then very likely that won't last past. And they'll likely use that as the narrative to do anti-extremism training within government, military, police to begin ideological purges. They've already started doing this. And really we'll have to see how this affects things with state law and also how it affects things with 2022. Because they're pushing things a bit strong right now. They're pushing things a bit too rapidly. They're pushing things to the extent right now that they may not have the authority or ability to do it. And frankly, the pushback may be stronger than they anticipate when it comes to people going to the polls and actually voting against these policies in 2022, a movement that will very soon happen. Now, keep in mind that Trump has again started this PAC. He's now in the process of registering this PAC. He's talking about launching this new social network within 2 to 3 months. His top advisor said he would do it. Trump has not personally confirmed it, but you're about to see a grassroots movement aimed at campaigning, political, taking back the political systems through vote, beginning very soon. And so, folks, get ready for an interesting battle of narrative, I think, coming up. Really, within the next 2 to 3 months, we're going to be seeing a lot about this. Next 2 to 3 months, get ready for the narrative battle in the U.S. One that will determine, I think, the future of this country. And as this happens too, I've mentioned a lot's going to be happening with China. I'm going to be covering a bit more with what's happening with China because that's another big thing to watch. In the U.S., we have our own political issues. This has some effect on the rest of the world. I'll be covering some world politics as well. But China is what's going to affect everything. And as things move forward with the Chinese Communist Party, I will be keeping you all updated on this. All right, folks, that said, I'm doing these live Q&As every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. I'll be back on Sunday, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time, so be sure to tune in. Also, please check out the interviews I've been publishing. I think you really like them. Also, we do have this new special series in the works right now on the history of communism and history of ideology to an extent. I think you'll really like it. We've already started filming it. It's taking a bit of time, so give us some time, but we are in the process of filming it. That said, folks, again, if you want to support us, we're demonetized. You can support us on Patreon or Donor Box. We do have links in the description below. Also, it does help us still if you do like and subscribe to this channel. It does help us. All right, that said, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.